When my husband's secretary accidentally sent me their intimate vacation photos instead of the quarterly reports, she had no idea she was handing me the evidence that would expose a decade of lies and transform me from dismissed housewife to the CEO of a multi-million-dollar empire. What happened next proved that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who assume you are powerless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room at Sterling & Associates fell silent as every eye turned toward me, their expressions ranging from barely concealed amusement to outright contempt. I stood at the head of the polished granite table, holding a manila folder containing financial projections that represented months of careful analysis, while 23 of Chicago's most influential business leaders stared at me as if I had materialized from thin air. "Victoria," my husband Richard Sterling said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone I had grown to despise over our 15 years of marriage. "This is a board meeting, not a charity luncheon planning session." The laughter that followed his dismissal echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 48th floor conference room, creating a symphony of professional condescension that made my cheeks burn with familiar humiliation. These executives, who controlled investment portfolios worth billions of dollars, found the spectacle of a housewife attempting to contribute to strategic business discussions thoroughly entertaining. My name is Victoria Sterling, and I am 42 years old. For the past 15 years, I have existed in the shadow of my husband's financial empire, relegated to the role of supportive spouse whose primary responsibilities involve hosting dinner parties, organizing charity events, and maintaining the pristine appearance that complements Richard's image as a successful investment firm founder. To everyone in that conference room, I represented nothing more than decorative infrastructure, the well-dressed wife whose presence at company functions suggested stability and traditional values that reassured conservative investors and board members. What they did not know was that beneath my carefully maintained exterior lay a Master of Business Administration degree from Northwestern University, and 8 years of experience in financial analysis that I had abandoned when Richard convinced me that his career required a full-time support system at home. The Sterling & Associates headquarters occupied prime real estate in Chicago's financial district, its marble lobby and mahogany-paneled offices serving as monuments to the investment empire that Richard had built through aggressive acquisition strategies and strategic partnerships with pension funds and municipal governments. The company managed retirement portfolios for teachers, firefighters, and public employees across the Midwest, controlling assets that represented the financial security of hundreds of thousands of working families. Standing in that conference room, holding projections that revealed critical vulnerabilities in their investment strategy, I felt the weight of knowledge that nobody else possessed or valued. The analysis I had prepared during countless evenings while Richard attended business dinners showed clear patterns of risk concentration that could devastate their clients' retirement funds during the next economic downturn. "Richard," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "I am telling you that the municipal bond allocations in your largest pension portfolios are creating dangerous exposure to interest rate fluctuations. The modeling I have done indicates potential losses that could affect retirement security for over 200,000 public employees." The silence that followed felt dense with incredulity and mounting irritation. Richard's expression shifted from amusement to annoyance as he processed what I had said, while the other board members exchanged glances that suggested they were witnessing an embarrassing domestic dispute rather than a serious strategic discussion. Richard Sterling represented everything I had once admired and everything I had grown to understand about the corruption that accompanies unchecked authority. At 51 years old, he possessed the kind of confidence that comes from building a financial empire through aggressive tactics and strategic manipulation of regulatory relationships. His corner office displayed photographs of himself with governors, senators, and federal regulators, each image strategically positioned to suggest intimate relationships with the most powerful figures in American finance. But the most revealing aspect of Richard's character was not his professional success, but his systematic diminishment of anyone who might threaten his authority or question his judgment. His treatment of employees, business partners, and family members followed consistent patterns of dominance and control that ensured his continued supremacy in every relationship and professional context. I had observed Richard's leadership approach for 15 years, noting how he treated different categories of people with distinct variations of respect or contempt. With major investors and regulatory officials, he became charming and deferential, carefully managing relationships that could influence his firm's growth and profitability. With board members and senior executives, he adopted a collaborative demeanor that concealed his ultimate control over strategic decisions. But with anyone he considered subordinate, junior employees, administrative staff, and certainly his wife, he displayed casual cruelty that revealed his fundamental character. "Victoria," Richard continued, his voice carrying the false patience typically reserved for children or pets, "I appreciate your interest in our business operations, but investment strategy requires expertise that extends far beyond reading financial magazines and attending charity board meetings." The irony of his statement struck me with devastating clarity. I had earned my MBA with concentrations in portfolio management and risk analysis, graduating summa cum laude from one of the most respected business schools in the country. My thesis research had focused on pension fund management and the regulatory frameworks that governed public employee retirement systems. Before our marriage, I had worked for 6 years as a senior analyst at a boutique investment firm that specialized in municipal finance and public sector asset management. But none of that mattered in this conference room. Here I existed only as Victoria Sterling, supportive wife, whose opinions about finance carried the same weight as her observations about interior decorating or social event planning. "Sir," I persisted, knowing that this moment represented my last opportunity to prevent a catastrophe that I could see developing with mathematical certainty. "The Federal Reserve's interest rate projections indicate a tightening cycle that will significantly impact long-duration municipal bonds. The concentration ratios in your pension portfolios exceed prudent risk management guidelines by factors that could trigger regulatory intervention." Richard's face flushed red, as murmurs of discomfort rippled through the assembled board members. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that professional responsibility might overcome personal prejudice, that the magnitude of the financial risk would compel them to listen regardless of who was delivering the warning. That hope died when Richard slammed his hand against the conference table, with enough force to rattle the crystal water glasses and send several board members recoiling in their leather chairs. "Enough," he declared, his voice echoing off the glass walls with an authority that demanded immediate compliance. "Victoria, you are here because I requested your presence during this quarterly review to demonstrate our firm's commitment to family values and long-term stability. Your role is to smile appropriately and show our board members that Sterling & Associates represents more than just financial returns. We represent traditional American values and generational wealth building." The board members around the table nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from relief to renewed amusement as their worldview reasserted itself. The housewife had been put back in her proper place, order had been restored, and they could return to the important business of managing billions of dollars in retirement assets without interference from domestic concerns. But I recognized something else in their faces that chilled me more than Richard's condescension. I saw complete dismissal of the possibility that someone in my position could possess knowledge that might protect their clients' financial security. They were not rejecting my analysis because they had considered and disagreed with it. They were rejecting it because of who I was, not what I knew. Standing there under their collective gaze, I remembered the moment 8 years earlier when everything in my life had changed direction. I had been working as a senior analyst at Morrison Financial, building a reputation for identifying risk patterns that other analysts missed, when Richard began his systematic campaign to convince me that his success required my full-time support at home. "Victoria," he had said during one of our early conversations about marriage and career priorities, "I am building something that will benefit both of us and any children we might have. Kind Urides. But this kind of success requires complete focus and dedication. I need a partner who can manage our personal life so that I can concentrate entirely on business growth." The transition from promising financial analyst to supportive housewife had not been easy, but Richard had made compelling arguments about the temporary nature of the sacrifice and the long-term benefits that would result from his career advancement. He had promised that once Sterling & Associates achieved stability and market leadership, I would have opportunities to return to professional work in whatever capacity I chose. But temporary solutions have a way of becoming permanent when they serve someone else's interests. And 8 years had passed before I realized that I had become trapped in a role that utilized none of my knowledge or capabilities, while providing Richard with the domestic stability that enhanced his professional image. The financial projections I had prepared during my evenings alone in our Lincoln Park mansion represented more than academic exercise or intellectual curiosity. They reflected my growing understanding that Richard's investment strategies were creating risks that could destroy the retirement security of hundreds of thousands of public employees who trusted Sterling and Associates to protect their financial futures. Victoria, Richard continued, his tone softening into the kind of false kindness that felt more insulting than outright hostility, you are clearly passionate about financial markets and investment strategy. Perhaps you should consider taking some continuing education courses if you want to understand these complex topics well enough to contribute to serious discussions. The suggestion that I should consider pursuing the education I had already completed, delivered by a man whose understanding of risk management came from delegating analysis to subordinates rather than conducting it himself, represented the final insult in this public humiliation. I understand, I replied, my voice carefully controlled despite the rage building in my chest. I apologize for interrupting your meeting. No harm done, Richard said magnanimously, as if he were pardoning a minor social transgression rather than dismissing a warning about potential financial catastrophe that could affect hundreds of thousands of retirees. We appreciate your commitment to our family's success, even if your concerns are outside your area of expertise. I gathered my financial projections, knowing that none of the board members would request copies or ask follow-up questions about the risk analysis I had prepared. To them, my work represented nothing more than an amusing interruption in their important business, a reminder of the proper hierarchy that governed their professional world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As I walked toward the conference room exit, Richard delivered his final judgment with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his own authority or questioned the systems that maintained his power. Victoria, you are excellent at managing our household and representing our family at social functions. I suggest you focus on those responsibilities and leave investment management to the qualified professionals we employ for exactly that purpose. The conference room door closed behind me with a soft click that seemed to echo with finality. I stood in the marble-floored corridor outside, surrounded by the quiet hum of a financial empire in motion, holding evidence of investment risks that could destroy everything they had built while devastating the retirement security of their clients. In that moment, I realized that my choice was not between speaking up and remaining silent. My choice was between accepting their definition of my limitations or proving that knowledge and capability cannot be contained by marriage vows or social expectations. The humiliation I had just experienced would either mark the end of my attempts to contribute to meaningful decision-making or become the catalyst for a transformation that would change everything. Standing in that hallway, I made a decision that would ultimately expose not only Richard's professional incompetence, but also the personal betrayals that had been hidden beneath our marriage's carefully maintained surface. The real battle was just beginning, and the weapons I would use in that battle were already closer than anyone imagined. The manila folder in my hands contained more than financial projections. It contained evidence of my expertise, documentation of their failures, and proof that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones who have been systematically underestimated by those who mistake authority for intelligence. What I did not know at that moment was that within 72 hours, an accidental email from Richard's secretary would provide me with evidence that would transform me from dismissed housewife to the most powerful woman in Chicago's financial district. The real story was about to begin. The digital clock on my laptop read 11:23 p.m. as I sat in the study of our Lincoln Park mansion, surrounded by financial reports and investment portfolios that most people would consider mind-numbingly complex. The house around me was silent, except for the occasional sound of Chicago traffic filtering through the triple-paned windows that Richard had installed to create the perfect environment for his business entertaining. This had become my domain during the past 8 years, the late evening hours when Richard attended client dinners or networking events, leaving me alone with the financial data that he considered too sophisticated for my understanding. During these solitary sessions, I had discovered that investment portfolios reveal their secrets to those who possess both the technical knowledge to interpret complex data and the patience to identify patterns that others overlook. My routine during these evening analysis sessions had evolved into a systematic examination of Sterling and Associates, investment holdings, risk metrics, and portfolio allocations across their various client accounts. Richard's home office contained complete financial records for the firm's operations, including detailed breakdowns of pension fund investments, municipal bond portfolios, and the asset allocation strategies that governed retirement security for hundreds of thousands of public employees. What had begun as intellectual curiosity about the business that consumed my husband's professional attention had gradually transformed into comprehensive analysis that revealed disturbing patterns of risk concentration and strategic miscalculations that could threaten the financial security of their clients. Tonight's investigation focused on the quarterly portfolio rebalancing reports that Richard's investment committee had approved during the previous month. The documents spread across my mahogany desk told a story that would have alarmed any competent risk analyst. But I knew from experience that raising concerns would result in the same dismissive response I had received during the afternoon's humiliating board meeting. The mathematical reality revealed by the data was both clear and terrifying. Sterling and Associates had concentrated their largest pension fund portfolios in long-duration municipal bonds issued by municipalities whose fiscal stability depended entirely on continued federal subsidies and state revenue transfers. The correlation between these bond issues meant that economic pressure in any single region could trigger cascading defaults that would devastate retirement funds across multiple states. More troubling, the Federal Reserve's published monetary policy projections indicated an aggressive interest rate tightening cycle that would begin within 6 months and continue for at least 18 months. The duration risk inherent in Sterling and Associates bond portfolios meant that even modest rate increases would trigger significant principal losses that could reduce retirement account values by 20 to 30%. I spent 3 hours that evening constructing detailed financial models that quantified the potential losses facing their clients under various interest rate scenarios. The projections revealed that the investment strategy Richard's firm was implementing could result in retirement fund losses exceeding $2 billion if economic conditions developed according to the Federal Reserve's published guidance. But the most damning aspect of my analysis was not the magnitude of potential losses, but the ease with which they could be prevented through standard risk management practices that any competent investment firm should have implemented automatically. The portfolio rebalancing required to protect their clients would involve straightforward adjustments to duration exposure and geographic diversification that could be accomplished within 60 days without significant transaction costs. The evidence suggested that Sterling and Associates was either deliberately ignoring established risk management principles or lacked the analytical capability to recognize the dangers inherent in their current investment strategy. Either explanation raised serious questions about their competence to manage retirement assets for public employees who depended on these investments for basic financial security during their retirement years. As I reviewed the portfolio data more carefully, I began to understand that the problem extended beyond simple analytical oversight or strategic miscalculation. The investment allocations revealed patterns that suggested systematic bias toward municipal bond issues from specific regions and specific underwriters, creating concentration risks that violated generally accepted portfolio management principles. The geographic concentration was particularly alarming. Nearly 60% of their municipal bond holdings originated from municipalities in 3 states, whose economies depended heavily on industries that were facing significant regulatory pressure and technological disruption. The correlation between these regional economies meant that adverse developments in any single sector could trigger simultaneous fiscal crises across multiple municipalities, creating precisely the kind of cascading defaults that prudent portfolio management seeks to prevent. More disturbing was the revelation that Sterling and Associates appeared to be receiving unusually favorable pricing on these municipal bond purchases, suggesting relationships with underwriters that might involve compensation arrangements not fully disclosed to their clients. The pricing data indicated that their firm was paying significantly below market rates for bonds that carried substantially above market risks, a combination that typically indicates either analytical errors or undisclosed conflicts of interest. I spent additional time that evening researching the underwriting firms involved in these municipal bond transactions, discovering a network of financial relationships that connected Richard's firm to political figures and regulatory officials whose approval was essential for the municipal bond issuances that comprised their largest investment positions. The pattern that emerged from this investigation revealed what appeared to be a systematic strategy of leveraging political relationships to secure favorable investment terms, while transferring the associated risks to pension fund clients who lacked the information necessary to evaluate the true quality of their retirement investments. This discovery transformed my understanding of the stakes involved in the risk management concerns I had attempted to raise during the board meeting. The potential losses facing their clients were not simply the result of analytical oversight or strategic miscalculation. They represented the consequences of investment decisions that prioritized short-term profits for Sterling and Associates over long-term security for the public employees whose retirement funds they managed. The implications of what I was discovering extended far beyond corporate incompetence or professional negligence. The investment strategy that Richard's firm was implementing could potentially constitute a violation of their fiduciary obligations to pension fund clients, creating legal liability that could result in regulatory sanctions, civil penalties, and criminal prosecution for the executives responsible for these decisions. But I also recognized that this analysis meant nothing if I could not convince someone in authority to investigate these practices and take appropriate corrective action. Richard's dismissive response to my risk management concerns had demonstrated that he would not listen to warnings about investment strategy regardless of their validity or the potential consequences for their clients. The other board members who had witnessed my humiliation during the afternoon meeting would likely respond with similar skepticism and condescension, viewing any concerns raised by a housewife as uninformed speculation rather than professional analysis based on comprehensive financial modeling and risk assessment. As I prepared to conclude my evening research session, I accessed the secure email system that Richard used for confidential communications with clients and business partners. My administrative access to these systems had been established years earlier to enable me to manage social scheduling and coordinate business entertainment, but it also provided visibility into communications that revealed additional details about the firm's operations and strategic planning. The email correspondence I reviewed that evening confirmed my worst suspicions about the investment practices I had identified through portfolio analysis. Internal communications between Richard and his senior investment committee revealed conscious decisions to accept higher risk levels in exchange for improved fee structures and enhanced political relationships that could benefit future business development. More alarming, the email communications included discussions about regulatory compliance strategies that appeared designed to minimize disclosure requirements while maximizing their ability to maintain investment positions that clearly violated prudent risk management principles. The tone and content of these communications suggested systematic efforts to circumvent oversight mechanisms that were designed to protect pension fund clients from exactly the kind of inappropriate risk exposure that their portfolios contained. One email exchange between Richard and the firm's compliance officer was particularly revealing. The discussions centered on strategies for responding to potential regulatory inquiries about their municipal bond concentration, without providing information that might trigger more detailed investigation of their investment practices or political relationships. The communications indicated that Sterling and Associates was fully aware of the risks inherent in their investment strategy, but had made conscious decisions to prioritize short-term profitability over client protection. The email evidence suggested that their approach to pension fund management was designed to extract maximum fees while transferring investment risks to public employees who lacked both the information and the resources necessary to protect themselves from inappropriate portfolio management. Reading these internal communications felt like discovering evidence of a carefully planned betrayal of trust that extended far beyond simple business disagreements or strategic differences. The pension fund clients who depended on Sterling and Associates for retirement security were being systematically exploited by people who understood the risks they were creating but chose to prioritize their own financial interests over their fiduciary obligations. The weight of this discovery pressed against my chest like a physical force as I realized that hundreds of thousands of teachers, firefighters, police officers, and other public employees were depending on investment strategies that could destroy their retirement security. These were not abstract financial projections or theoretical risk scenarios. They represented real people whose ability to maintain dignity and independence during their retirement years was being jeopardized by investment practices that prioritized political relationships and fee generation over prudent portfolio management. But I also understood that my knowledge of these practices meant nothing if I could not find a way to expose them that would result in appropriate corrective action. The same institutional barriers that had prevented my risk management concerns from being heard during the board meeting would likely prevent external authorities from taking my analysis seriously if it came from someone without formal standing in the financial services industry. The evidence I had gathered during my evening investigation painted a comprehensive picture of investment practices that appeared to violate both professional standards and legal requirements for pension fund management. But transforming that evidence into effective action would require strategic thinking that took into account the political relationships and institutional protections that shielded Sterling and Associates from routine accountability. As I compiled my research findings into organized files that documented the scope and severity of the problems I had identified, I began to understand that this situation presented an opportunity to prove that expertise and analytical capability could overcome institutional bias and social prejudice when the stakes were high enough to demand action. The financial projections spread across my desk represented more than academic analysis or intellectual exercise. They provided evidence of my competence and professional capability that could not be dismissed through condescending references to my role as a supportive housewife. The mathematical precision of the risk models I had constructed would demonstrate to any qualified reviewer that my analysis was based on sophisticated understanding of portfolio management principles and regulatory frameworks. More importantly, the evidence I had discovered created moral obligations that extended far beyond personal vindication or professional recognition. The retirement security of hundreds of thousands of public employees was being threatened by investment practices that appeared to violate the most basic principles of fiduciary responsibility. My knowledge of these threats created both the opportunity and the obligation to take action that could protect vulnerable people from financial exploitation. The decision I made in that study during the early morning hours of what would become the most important week of my life was not about challenging Richard's authority or proving my professional competence. It was about using knowledge and capability in service of protecting people who had been betrayed by those they trusted to safeguard their financial futures. What I could not have anticipated was that within 48 hours, an accidental email from Richard's secretary would provide me with additional evidence that would transform my understanding of both the scope of the betrayal and the resources available to address it. The real battle was about to begin, and the weapons I would need were already being delivered to my inbox by the very people who considered me powerless to use them effectively. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of our Lincoln Park mansion as I sat at the kitchen island, holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold while I reflected on the events that had shaped my journey from promising financial analyst to dismissed housewife. The contrast between my current circumstances and the career trajectory I had once pursued felt particularly stark after the previous evening's discovery of the systematic financial misconduct that threatened hundreds of thousands of retirement accounts. The kitchen where I now spent my mornings planning social events and managing household affairs had once been the setting for late-night study sessions during my MBA program at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. The granite countertops that now displayed carefully arranged fresh flowers had previously been covered with financial textbooks, case studies, and complex mathematical models that formed the foundation of my expertise in portfolio management and risk analysis. My path to Northwestern had begun 22 years earlier in the small town of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where I grew up as the daughter of Margaret and Robert Hartley. My father worked as an accounting supervisor for a mid-sized agricultural equipment manufacturer, while my mother managed the administrative operations of the county's largest medical clinic. Together, they created a household where financial responsibility and analytical thinking were not just encouraged, but treated as essential life skills that would determine my ability to achieve independence and security. The Hartley family approach to financial planning reflected the pragmatic values of the Midwest, where economic uncertainty was a constant reality that required careful preparation and systematic risk management. My parents had both witnessed the devastating effects of agricultural economic cycles on their community, observing how families who failed to plan for economic downturns could lose everything they had built through decades of hard work and careful saving. This environment taught me early that financial security required more than simply earning income. It demanded sophisticated understanding of economic trends, investment principles, and risk management strategies that could protect accumulated wealth from the inevitable cycles of expansion and contraction that characterized modern economic systems. My parents encouraged my interest in mathematics and economic analysis, recognizing that these skills would provide opportunities for economic advancement that had not been available to their generation. During my undergraduate years at the University of Iowa, I majored in economics with a concentration in financial markets, developing expertise in the quantitative analysis techniques that would later enable me to identify the portfolio risks that Richard's firm was systematically ignoring. My senior thesis examined the correlation patterns between municipal bond defaults and regional economic stress, research that provided the theoretical foundation for understanding the concentration risks that Sterling and Associates was creating in their pension fund portfolios. The academic recognition I received for this research attracted the attention of Northwestern University's MBA admissions committee, who offered me a full scholarship to pursue graduate studies in their finance and risk management program. The opportunity to study at one of the most prestigious business schools in the country represented the culmination of everything my parents had sacrificed to make possible, and the beginning of a career trajectory that could have taken me to the highest levels of the financial services industry. Northwestern's MBA program during the late 1990s emphasized practical application of theoretical knowledge through internships and consulting projects with major financial institutions. My second-year internship at Goldman Sachs provided exposure to sophisticated risk management practices and portfolio optimization techniques that were being developed for institutional clients, including pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds. The mentorship I received from Dr. Catherine Morrison, Northwestern's leading expert in pension fund management, shaped my understanding of the fiduciary obligations that governed institutional investment practices. Dr. Morrison had previously served as a senior advisor to the Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration, and her coursework emphasized the legal and ethical frameworks that protected retirement plan participants from exploitation by investment managers who might prioritize their own interests over client welfare. Under Dr. Morrison's guidance, I completed a master's thesis that examined optimization strategies for public employee pension funds, focusing specifically on the risk management techniques that could protect retirement security during periods of economic volatility. The research required extensive analysis of municipal bond markets, interest rate risk modeling, and correlation analysis between public sector fiscal health and investment portfolio performance. This academic work provided me with exactly the expertise that would later enable me to identify the systematic violations of fiduciary responsibility that Richard's firm was implementing in their management of public employee retirement funds. The irony that my specialized knowledge was being dismissed as irrelevant housewife speculation would have been amusing if the consequences for their clients were not so serious. Following graduation from Northwestern in 2001, I accepted a position as a senior financial analyst at Morrison Asset Management, a boutique investment firm that specialized in pension fund consulting and institutional portfolio management. The firm's client base consisted primarily of public employee retirement systems, labor union pension funds, and corporate defined benefit plans that required sophisticated risk management and regulatory compliance expertise. My role at Morrison involved conducting due diligence analysis for pension fund investment committees, developing asset allocation recommendations that balanced return objectives with risk management requirements, and monitoring portfolio performance to ensure compliance with fiduciary standards and regulatory guidelines. The work required exactly the kind of detailed analytical capability that I had later applied to understanding the problems in Richard's investment strategies. The 6 years I spent at Morrison Asset Management provided comprehensive training in every aspect of institutional investment management, from initial client consultation through ongoing portfolio monitoring and performance reporting. I learned to identify the warning signs that indicated inappropriate risk concentrations, regulatory compliance failures, and potential conflicts of interest that could compromise client welfare. More importantly, I developed expertise in communicating complex financial concepts to investment committee members who often lacked sophisticated financial backgrounds but bore ultimate responsibility for protecting their participants' retirement security. This experience taught me that effective risk management required not just technical analysis but also the ability to translate quantitative findings into strategic recommendations that non-experts could understand and implement effectively. The professional recognition I received at Morrison included promotion to Associate Director of Pension Consulting and responsibility for managing relationships with some of the firm's largest institutional clients. My analytical work had contributed to portfolio performance improvements that enhanced retirement security for over 50,000 public employees, and my consulting recommendations had helped several pension funds avoid significant losses during the market volatility of the early 2000s. But this promising career trajectory was disrupted when I met Richard Sterling at a Chicago financial services industry conference in 2007. His charm and sophistication were immediately apparent, as was his success in building Sterling & Associates into one of the Midwest's most influential investment management firms. His attention felt flattering and exciting after years of focusing exclusively on professional development and career advancement. Richard's courtship was methodical and persuasive, emphasizing his vision of building a financial empire that would require a sophisticated partner who could manage the social and administrative aspects of business development while he focused on investment strategy and client acquisition. He painted an appealing picture of shared success, where my analytical skills would be applied to supporting his firm's growth rather than competing in the broader financial services marketplace. The decision to leave Morrison Asset Management and marry Richard represented the most significant career sacrifice I had ever made, but his arguments about the benefits of collaboration rather than competition were compelling. He assured me that my expertise would be essential to Sterling & Associates' continued success, and that partnership with him would provide opportunities for influence and impact that would exceed anything I could achieve through independent career advancement. The early years of our marriage had reinforced these expectations, as Richard frequently sought my input on investment strategy questions and included me in discussions about business development opportunities. My background in pension fund management proved valuable for understanding the needs and concerns of their public sector clients, and my analytical skills contributed to several successful investment initiatives that enhanced the firm's reputation and profitability. But gradually, Richard's requests for my professional input became less frequent, while his expectations about my social and administrative responsibilities expanded significantly. The transition was subtle but systematic, as business entertainment requirements, charity board obligations, and household management duties consumed increasing amounts of time that had previously been available for analytical work and strategic planning. By the 5th year of our marriage, I had effectively become a full-time administrator for Richard's business and social activities, with little opportunity to apply the specialized knowledge that had made me valuable to him initially. The financial expertise I had developed through years of education and professional experience was relegated to managing our personal investment portfolio and monitoring our household budget. The transformation from financial analyst to social hostess was not the result of any explicit decision or dramatic change in circumstances. It occurred through gradual erosion of professional engagement that left me increasingly isolated from the work that had provided meaning and identity throughout my adult life. Richard's success continued to grow during this period, but my contributions to that success became less visible and less valued, as his firm's growth attracted administrative staff who could handle routine business support functions. The financial analysis I had conducted during the previous evening represented my first systematic application of professional skills to Richard's business operations in over 3 years. The discovery of serious risk management failures and potential fiduciary violations had reminded me of both my analytical capabilities and my moral obligations to protect people who depended on competent investment management for their financial security. The irony of my situation was that the very expertise Richard had originally valued in our relationship was now being dismissed as irrelevant speculation by someone whose own understanding of investment principles was largely dependent on analysis prepared by subordinates. The 8 years I had spent supporting his career development had apparently convinced him that my value was limited to social and administrative functions that required no specialized knowledge or analytical capability. But the evidence I had uncovered during my investigation of Sterling & Associates' investment practices represented an opportunity to prove that knowledge and analytical skill retain their value regardless of the social roles that might obscure them. The mathematical precision of my risk analysis and the comprehensive nature of my regulatory compliance review demonstrated competence that could not be dismissed through condescending references to my status as a supportive housewife. More importantly, the discovery of systematic violations of fiduciary responsibility created moral obligations that transcended personal considerations about career advancement or professional recognition. The hundreds of thousands of public employees whose retirement security was being threatened by Richard's investment practices deserved protection from someone who possessed both the knowledge to understand the risks they faced and the analytical capability to document those risks with sufficient precision to compel corrective action. The decision I had made during the early morning hours after completing my analysis was not about personal vindication or career rehabilitation. It was about using specialized knowledge in service of protecting vulnerable people from financial exploitation by those who had violated their trust and ignored their fiduciary obligations. The morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows illuminated the financial reports that documented the scope and severity of the problems I had identified, serving as a reminder that knowledge carries with it the responsibility to act when action can prevent harm to others. The real test of my character and professional capability was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether institutional power and social prejudice could triumph over analytical competence and moral conviction. Richard Sterling's corner office occupied the entire northwest corner of the 48th floor at Sterling & Associates, commanding panoramic views of Lake Michigan and Chicago's financial district that served as daily reminders of his position at the apex of the city's investment management hierarchy. The office itself represented a carefully orchestrated monument to success, filled with artifacts that told the story Richard wanted the world to believe about his journey from ambitious Northwestern graduate to founder of one of the Midwest's most influential financial services firms. The mahogany shelves that lined his office walls displayed awards and recognitions that spoke primarily of business relationships rather than investment performance. The Illinois Investment Management Association's Leadership Award, the Chicago Economic Club's Entrepreneur of the Year recognition, and various civic honors reflected his skill at building political connections and maintaining industry visibility rather than demonstrating superior analytical capability or client service excellence. The photographs covering his credenza showed Richard with governors, senators, federal regulators, and prominent business leaders, each image strategically positioned to suggest intimate relationships with the most powerful figures in American finance and politics. These visual displays served a crucial function in client meetings, creating impressions of access and influence that often proved more persuasive than detailed discussions of investment strategy or performance metrics. But the most revealing aspect of Richard's office was not what it displayed, but what it concealed about the foundations upon which his empire had been constructed. Behind the impressive facade lay a career built on leveraging family connections, appropriating subordinates, analytical work, and systematically eliminating anyone who might expose the gap between his public reputation and his actual investment expertise. At 51 years old, Richard possessed the kind of confidence that emerges from 3 decades of avoiding accountability for his decisions while claiming credit for others' achievements. His path through Northwestern University's business school had been facilitated by his father's position as a major donor and board member, while his early career advancement had been guided by family connections that opened doors, regardless of his demonstrated competence or analytical capability. The venture capital firm where Richard began his career, Sterling Capital Partners, belonged to his uncle Harrison Sterling, whose wealth originated from Chicago real estate development during the urban renewal programs of the 1970s and 1980s. Richard's rapid promotion through the firm's ranks reflected family politics rather than professional achievement, and his eventual partnership status was granted based on his last name rather than his contribution to investment returns or business development. When Richard founded Sterling & Associates in 1995, the initial capital came entirely from family sources, while his first institutional clients were pension funds and municipal investment pools that maintained business relationships with Sterling family enterprises. The firm's early growth was orchestrated through strategic networking and political relationship building rather than demonstrated investment expertise or superior analytical capability. Richard's approach to business development reflected his fundamental understanding that perception often mattered more than reality in institutional investment management, where decision-makers frequently lacked the technical knowledge necessary to evaluate investment competence independently. He had mastered the art of speaking confidently about market trends and investment strategies while carefully avoiding detailed discussions that might expose his limitations in quantitative analysis or risk management. His corner office served as the primary stage for this performance, equipped with multiple Bloomberg terminals and real-time market data displays that he rarely consulted for actual investment decision-making. The technical briefings his staff prepared were consistently condensed into executive summaries that emphasized business implications and client relationship considerations, rather than the analytical details that would have revealed his dependence on subordinates for investment insights. Richard's greatest skill was not analytical or strategic thinking, but rather his intuitive understanding of how to navigate institutional politics and regulatory relationships in ways that protected his firm from scrutiny, while maximizing their ability to generate fees from clients who trusted them to manage critical retirement assets. His charm and sophistication impressed pension fund trustees and municipal finance officers, who often lacked the background necessary to evaluate investment competence independently. The board of directors that governed Sterling and Associates reflected Richard's systematic approach to surrounding himself with people whose authority derived from political connections rather than financial expertise. The board included former governors, retired federal officials, and prominent business leaders whose primary qualification was their ability to enhance the firm's credibility with institutional clients rather than their capability to provide meaningful oversight of investment practices. This governance structure served Richard's interests by creating the appearance of sophisticated oversight while ensuring that board members lacked both the motivation and the expertise necessary to challenge his investment decisions or question his strategic direction. The quarterly board meetings typically focused on business development opportunities and client relationship management, rather than detailed examination of portfolio performance or risk management practices. The executives who reported directly to Richard had learned through experience that their career advancement depended not on the quality of their analytical work, but on their willingness to support his narrative about the firm's success and his personal role in achieving superior investment results. Those who challenged his authority or questioned his decisions found themselves marginalized through strategic exclusion from important meetings, reassignment to less influential roles, or encouragement to seek opportunities elsewhere. The investment committee that supposedly governed Sterling and Associates' portfolio management decisions was structured to ensure Richard's continued control over strategic direction while providing legal protection through the appearance of collaborative decision-making. The committee included senior executives whose compensation and job security depended on maintaining Richard's approval, creating systematic bias toward supporting his preferences regardless of their analytical merit. This organizational design enabled Richard to claim credit for successful investment outcomes, while deflecting responsibility for poor performance to market conditions or external factors beyond his control. The quarterly performance reports prepared for clients consistently emphasized favorable comparisons with benchmark indices, while downplaying risk-adjusted returns or correlation analysis that might reveal the true quality of the firm's investment management. The fee structure that Sterling and Associates employed for pension fund management was particularly revealing of Richard's priorities and approach to client relationships. The firm charged management fees based on total assets under management rather than investment performance, creating incentives to maximize portfolio values and minimize client withdrawals regardless of whether growth was achieved through superior investment selection or simply market appreciation. Additionally, the firm received transaction fees and placement fees from municipal bond underwriters whose securities comprised the largest components of their pension fund portfolios. These revenue streams created potential conflicts of interest that were disclosed in regulatory filings, but rarely explained to clients, in terms that would enable informed evaluation of how these arrangements might affect investment decision-making. The municipal bond concentration that characterized Sterling and Associates' pension fund portfolios reflected not sophisticated risk management or superior analytical insight, but rather Richard's systematic exploitation of political relationships that provided access to bond allocations at favorable pricing. The firm's connections with state and local political figures enabled them to participate in municipal bond offerings that generated both immediate placement fees and ongoing management fee revenue. This business model required continuous cultivation of political relationships through campaign contributions, charitable donations, and business entertainment that kept Richard constantly engaged in activities designed to maintain access to municipal bond underwriting opportunities. His calendar reflected this priority, with substantial time allocated to political fundraisers, industry conferences, and social events that strengthened relationships with elected officials and regulatory authorities. The risk management framework that governed Sterling and Associates' investment practices was designed primarily to satisfy regulatory compliance requirements rather than to protect clients from inappropriate risk exposure. The firm's risk management reports emphasized technical compliance with diversification guidelines and regulatory limits, while avoiding meaningful analysis of correlation risks, concentration exposures, or stress testing that might reveal vulnerabilities in their investment approach. Richard's dismissive attitude toward risk management reflected his confidence that political relationships and regulatory connections would provide protection from accountability if their investment strategies produced adverse outcomes for clients. His approach to pension fund management prioritized fee generation and business development over fiduciary responsibility, treating public employee retirement security as a secondary consideration to firm profitability. The culture that Richard had created at Sterling and Associates reflected his belief that authority and status were more important than analytical competence or professional integrity. The firm's hiring practices favored candidates with appropriate educational credentials and social connections, rather than demonstrated expertise in quantitative analysis or risk management. The promotion criteria emphasized relationship-building skills and political awareness, rather than investment performance or client service excellence. This organizational culture systematically discouraged the kind of independent analytical thinking that might identify problems with the firm's investment strategies or question the assumptions underlying their approach to pension fund management. Employees who raised concerns about risk management practices or suggested alternative investment approaches were typically dismissed as lacking sufficient understanding of the political and business considerations that drove strategic decision-making. The dismissive response that Richard had displayed toward my concerns about municipal bond concentration and interest rate risk reflected not just personal arrogance, but a systematic organizational approach to suppressing analytical input that might challenge established practices or threaten profitable client relationships. His confidence in dismissing my warnings was based on 15 years of successfully avoiding accountability for investment decisions, while maintaining the political relationships that protected his firm from regulatory scrutiny. The irony of Richard's position was that the very expertise he had originally valued when we met had become inconvenient, as his business model evolved toward political relationship management rather than analytical excellence. The pension fund consulting experience that had initially attracted his interest was now viewed as a threat to the simplified approach to investment management that enabled him to focus on business development while delegating analytical responsibility to subordinates. But Richard had made one crucial miscalculation in his systematic approach to avoiding accountability and suppressing analytical input. He had assumed that his ability to control the narrative within Sterling and Associates meant that he could control the broader consequences of his investment decisions, and that his political relationships would shield him from the mathematical realities that governed financial markets and regulatory compliance. The municipal bond concentration and interest rate risk that I had identified in his pension fund portfolios represented exactly the kind of systematic vulnerability that could not be managed through political relationships or regulatory connections. When economic conditions triggered the cascading defaults and principal losses that my analysis had predicted, the consequences would be determined by mathematical relationships rather than political influence. The systematic dismissal of analytical expertise that characterized Richard's leadership approach had created organizational blindness to risks that could destroy everything he had built through 3 decades of relationship cultivation and political maneuvering. The empire he had constructed was built on foundations that could not withstand the kind of economic stress that his investment strategies were systematically creating for his clients and his firm. The weight of discovery pressed against my consciousness with increasing intensity as I sat in my study during the early hours of Thursday morning, surrounded by financial documents that revealed the true scope of the catastrophe unfolding within Sterling and Associates' pension fund portfolios. The analysis I had completed during the previous 3 days extended far beyond the municipal bond concentration risks I had initially identified, exposing a web of interconnected vulnerabilities that could trigger the most devastating pension fund collapse in American history. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy announcement, scheduled for release the following Tuesday, would likely include interest rate guidance that would immediately impact the market valuation of long-duration municipal bonds. Based on the economic indicators and inflation data that had been published during the previous month, the central bank appeared positioned to announce an aggressive tightening cycle that would begin within 60 days and continue for at least 18 months. The mathematical modeling I had conducted throughout the week demonstrated that even the most conservative interest rate scenarios would trigger immediate principal losses exceeding 30% across Sterling and Associates' largest pension fund portfolios. The duration risk inherent in their municipal bond concentrations meant that moderate rate increases would produce cascading margin calls and forced liquidations that could eliminate decades of retirement contributions for hundreds of thousands of public employees. But the true magnitude of the threat became clear only when I began analyzing the broader network of interconnected financial relationships that connected Sterling and Associates to other institutional investment managers throughout the Midwest. The municipal bond underwriters who provided favorable pricing to Richard's firm maintained similar relationships with pension fund managers across 12 states, creating systematic correlation risks that could trigger simultaneous crises across multiple retirement systems. The geographic concentration of these municipal bond holdings created additional vulnerabilities that compounded the interest rate risks I had initially identified. Nearly 70% of the bonds in Sterling and Associates pension portfolios originated from municipalities whose fiscal stability depended on industries facing significant regulatory pressure and technological disruption. The automotive sector, coal-fired power generation, and traditional manufacturing represented the primary economic foundations for the regions whose municipal bonds comprised the largest components of their retirement fund investments. The correlation between these regional economies meant that adverse developments in any single sector could trigger simultaneous fiscal crises across multiple municipalities, creating precisely the kind of cascading defaults that prudent portfolio management seeks to prevent through diversification strategies. The concentration risks were particularly acute because the municipal bond offerings had been structured to maximize current yields rather than long-term stability, creating additional vulnerability to economic stress. My investigation revealed that the political relationships Richard had cultivated to secure favorable bond pricing were part of a broader network of arrangements that prioritized short-term fee generation over long-term fiduciary responsibility. The elected officials and regulatory authorities who facilitated access to municipal bond allocations were simultaneously promoting policies that increased the fiscal pressure on the municipalities whose bonds comprised their pension fund portfolios. The environmental regulations affecting coal-fired power generation, the trade policies impacting automotive manufacturing, and the infrastructure spending priorities that influenced municipal fiscal capacity were all being shaped by the same political figures who provided Sterling and Associates with preferential access to municipal bond underwriting opportunities. This created systematic conflicts of interest that ensured the firm's short-term profitability while undermining the long-term security of their clients' retirement investments. The scope of the potential catastrophe extended far beyond the immediate financial losses that would affect Sterling and Associates' clients. The public employee pension systems that depended on their investment management represented critical components of state and local government operations across the Midwest. Teachers, firefighters, police officers, highway maintenance workers, and healthcare employees whose retirement security was threatened by inappropriate investment strategies comprised the essential workforce that maintained basic government services for millions of Americans. The pension fund collapse that would result from the interest rate environment and municipal bond defaults I had identified would trigger immediate fiscal crises for state and local governments, whose budgets depended on stable retirement system contributions and predictable pension obligations. The political and economic consequences would extend far beyond the retirement security of individual public employees, to encompass the fundamental capacity of regional governments to maintain essential services. The timeline for these developments was compressed by economic factors that were already in motion and could not be reversed through investment strategy adjustments or political interventions. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions were driven by inflation data and economic indicators that required interest rate responses regardless of their impact on municipal bond portfolios or pension fund stability. The industrial and environmental trends affecting the regional economies that supported the municipal bond issuers were similarly irreversible, reflecting technological changes and regulatory frameworks that would continue regardless of their fiscal implications for local governments. The convergence of these economic forces created a window of vulnerability that would close within months. making immediate action essential to prevent catastrophic losses. But the most disturbing aspect of my analysis was the recognition that the potential catastrophe was entirely preventable through standard risk management practices that any competent investment firm should have implemented automatically. The portfolio rebalancing required to protect pension fund clients could be accomplished within 60 days through straightforward adjustments to duration exposure, geographic diversification, and sector allocation that would maintain target returns while eliminating concentration risks. The investment expertise required to implement these protective measures existed within Sterling & Associates' analytical staff, but the organizational culture that Richard had created systematically prevented independent risk assessment and strategic planning that might challenge established practices or threaten profitable client relationships. The firm's senior investment analysts possessed the technical knowledge necessary to identify and address the portfolio vulnerabilities I had discovered, but they lacked the authority and incentive structure necessary to override Richard's preference for maintaining profitable political relationships. The regulatory framework that governed pension fund investment practices provided legal mechanisms for compelling appropriate risk management through fiduciary responsibility enforcement and client disclosure requirements. The Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration maintained oversight authority that could require immediate corrective action if presented with evidence of systematic violations of prudent investment practices. Similarly, the Securities and Exchange Commission's investment advisor regulations provided enforcement mechanisms that could address conflicts of interest and inadequate risk management through sanctions that included civil penalties, business restrictions, and criminal referrals when circumstances warranted aggressive intervention. The regulatory tools necessary to protect pension fund clients existed within established legal frameworks, but they required activation by someone with both the analytical capability to document violations and the legal standing to compel regulatory attention. The evidence I had compiled during my investigation provided comprehensive documentation of systematic violations that would support regulatory intervention, but my status as a dismissed housewife created strategic challenges for ensuring that my analysis would receive appropriate consideration from authorities whose attention was typically focused on complaints from institutional sources or industry professionals. The moral implications of my situation extended far beyond personal considerations about career rehabilitation or professional recognition. The hundreds of thousands of public employees whose retirement security was threatened by Richard's investment practices had dedicated their careers to serving their communities through essential government services that maintained the foundations of American society. The teachers who had educated generations of children, the firefighters who had risked their lives to protect property and save lives, the police officers who had maintained public safety, and the healthcare workers who had provided essential medical services during the recent pandemic deserved protection from financial exploitation by investment managers who had violated their fiduciary obligations for personal profit. The retirees who had already left public service and were depending on their pension benefits for basic living expenses faced the prospect of devastating income reductions that could force them into poverty during the final years of their lives. The approaching catastrophe would affect not only current public employees, but also the thousands of retirees whose fixed incomes depended on the investment strategies that Richard's firm was implementing without regard for long-term sustainability. The broader implications for American society were equally significant. The collapse of public employee pension systems would undermine the capacity of state and local governments to attract and retain qualified workers for essential services, creating cascading effects that would reduce the quality of education, public safety, healthcare, and infrastructure maintenance that supported economic development and social stability. The economic disruption that would result from simultaneous pension fund crises across multiple states would trigger federal intervention and taxpayer bailouts that could cost hundreds of billions of dollars, while establishing precedents that encouraged similar irresponsible investment practices by other institutional managers who assumed that political connections would protect them from accountability. The decision I faced was not simply about exposing Richard's professional incompetence or challenging the dismissive attitude he had displayed toward my analytical capabilities. The choice before me was whether to accept a system that prioritized political relationships and short-term profits over fiduciary responsibility and client protection, or to take action that could prevent a catastrophe affecting millions of Americans who depended on competent investment management for their financial security. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows of my study illuminated the financial projections that documented both the scope of the approaching crisis and the opportunity to prevent it through immediate action. The mathematical precision of my risk models and the comprehensive nature of my regulatory compliance analysis provided evidence that could not be dismissed through condescending references to my social status or professional background. The specialized knowledge I had developed through years of education and professional experience in pension fund management created both the capability and the moral obligation to protect vulnerable people from financial exploitation. The expertise that Richard had systematically devalued and dismissed was precisely what was needed to address the crisis that his arrogance and incompetence had created. The transformation that would result from taking action extended beyond personal vindication to encompass the fundamental question of whether institutional power and political connections could triumph over analytical competence and moral conviction when the stakes involved the financial security of millions of Americans. The real test was not whether I possessed the knowledge and capability to expose systematic violations of fiduciary responsibility, but whether American institutions could recognize and respond to evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about expertise, authority, and accountability in the financial services industry. The Illinois Department of Insurance occupied a nondescript government building on West Jefferson Street in Springfield, its institutional architecture reflecting the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized state regulatory operations throughout the Midwest. The building's unremarkable facade concealed the substantial authority wielded by the department's Pension Fund Oversight Division, which maintained regulatory jurisdiction over public employee retirement systems that managed assets exceeding $40 billion across municipalities, school districts, and state agencies throughout Illinois. I arrived at the department's offices at precisely 9 o'clock on Friday morning, carrying a comprehensive briefcase containing the financial analysis, risk assessment documentation, and regulatory compliance review that I had prepared during the previous week. The elevator ride to the 7th floor provided final moments for reviewing the strategic approach I had developed, for presenting my concerns about Sterling & Associates' investment practices to officials whose professional responsibility included protecting public employee retirement security. The reception area outside the Pension Fund Oversight Division reflected the austere functionality that characterized most government offices, with standard institutional furniture and motivational posters about retirement planning that seemed almost ironic given the nature of my visit. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman whose nameplate identified her as Mrs. Patricia Williams, greeted me with the polite efficiency that suggested extensive experience managing appointments with concerned citizens, industry representatives, and regulatory petitioners. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, consulting her appointment calendar, "you are scheduled to meet with Director Thompson at 9:15 regarding pension fund compliance matters. May I ask what specific issues you would like to discuss during your meeting?" The question represented my first opportunity to articulate the purpose of my visit in terms that would establish credibility while avoiding the dismissive responses that had characterized my previous attempts to raise concerns about investment risk management. The strategic challenge was communicating the severity and urgency of the situation without triggering the kind of institutional skepticism that might result from a housewife claiming to have discovered systematic violations of fiduciary responsibility. I have identified significant concentration risks and potential regulatory compliance issues in municipal bond portfolios managed by Sterling & Associates, I replied, maintaining the professional demeanor that had served me effectively during my previous career in pension fund consulting. The analysis I have prepared indicates systematic violations of diversification requirements and prudent investment principles that could affect retirement security for public employees across multiple pension systems. Mrs. Williams made notes on her appointment log while directing me to the waiting area, where I spent 20 minutes reviewing the presentation materials I had organized to support my regulatory complaint. The documentation included detailed risk analysis, correlation studies, regulatory compliance assessments, and projections that quantified the potential financial impact on pension fund participants under various economic scenarios. Director Michael Thompson emerged from his office at 9:30, displaying the kind of measured professionalism that suggested extensive experience evaluating regulatory complaints from diverse sources. His handshake was firm and his greeting cordial, though I detected the subtle wariness that characterized interactions between government officials and private citizens, whose motivations and credibility remained unclear. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, gesturing toward his office, "Mrs. Williams indicated that you have concerns about pension fund investment practices that you believe may involve regulatory compliance issues. I would be interested in hearing about your analysis and understanding how our department might be able to assist with addressing any legitimate problems you have identified." Director Thompson's office reflected the practical functionality that characterized most government workspaces, with standard furniture, regulatory reference materials, and computer systems that provided access to the databases and analytical tools that supported pension fund oversight responsibilities. The walls displayed certificates and awards that indicated his professional qualifications and the department's commitment to protecting retirement security for Illinois public employees. The initial portion of our meeting focused on establishing the context and scope of my concerns about Sterling and Associates' investment practices. I began by providing background information about my educational qualifications and professional experience in pension fund management, emphasizing the analytical expertise that had enabled me to identify the risk patterns that formed the basis of my regulatory complaint. "Director Thompson," I said, opening the briefcase that contained my comprehensive analysis, "I have conducted detailed examination of municipal bond concentration patterns, interest rate risk exposure, and correlation analysis that indicates systematic violations of prudent investment principles in pension portfolios managed by Sterling and Associates. The evidence suggests potential fiduciary responsibility violations that could result in devastating losses for public employee retirement systems." Director Thompson accepted the documentation I presented while maintaining the kind of neutral expression that government officials develop to avoid premature judgments about complaints that might range from legitimate regulatory concerns to unfounded allegations motivated by personal grievances or misunderstandings about investment principles. The financial analysis I had prepared included detailed charts and graphs that illustrated the concentration risks, correlation patterns, and stress testing results that demonstrated the vulnerability of Sterling and Associates' pension portfolios to the economic conditions that were already developing. The mathematical modeling showed clear violations of diversification requirements and risk management standards that governed institutional investment practices. These projections indicate potential losses exceeding 30% of portfolio value if interest rate conditions develop according to Federal Reserve guidance, I explained, pointing to the specific charts that quantified the financial impact on pension fund participants. The concentration of municipal bond holdings from economically correlated regions creates systematic risk that violates generally accepted portfolio management principles. Director Thompson spent 45 minutes reviewing the documentation I had provided, asking detailed questions about the analytical methodology, data sources, and regulatory frameworks that supported my conclusions. His inquiries demonstrated sophisticated understanding of pension fund management principles and regulatory compliance requirements, suggesting that he possessed the technical expertise necessary to evaluate the validity of my concerns. The questioning process revealed both encouraging and concerning aspects of the regulatory oversight system. Director Thompson clearly understood the analytical concepts and regulatory frameworks that governed pension fund investment practices, and he recognized the potential significance of the violations I had identified. However, his responses also indicated the institutional limitations that could prevent effective action even when legitimate problems were documented with mathematical precision. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, closing the file folder that contained my analysis, "the documentation you have provided raises serious questions about investment practices and risk management that warrant further investigation. However, our department's regulatory authority is limited to pension systems that are directly administered by Illinois state and local government entities. Sterling and Associates operates as a private investment advisor that manages assets for pension systems in multiple states, which places their practices under federal regulatory jurisdiction." The explanation represented my first encounter with the bureaucratic complexity that characterizes financial services regulation in the United States, where overlapping federal and state authorities create opportunities for regulatory arbitrage that sophisticated firms exploit to avoid accountability. The institutional barriers that Director Thompson described were not designed to protect investors or pension fund participants, but rather to protect investment advisors from comprehensive oversight that might interfere with profitable practices. The Securities and Exchange Commission maintains primary regulatory authority over investment advisors like Sterling and Associates, Director Thompson continued. While the Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration oversees fiduciary responsibility compliance for pension fund management, our department can investigate specific pension systems within Illinois, but we cannot take direct action against investment advisors whose practices affect multiple jurisdictions. The regulatory framework that Director Thompson described created systematic obstacles to protecting pension fund participants from the kind of violations I had documented. The division of authority between federal and state agencies meant that no single regulator possessed both the jurisdiction and the analytical capability necessary to address comprehensive problems that affected pension systems across multiple states. More concerning was the revelation that regulatory action typically required complaints from institutional sources rather than individual citizens. Regardless of the quality or significance of the evidence presented, the analytical documentation I had prepared would carry greater weight if submitted by pension fund trustees, investment committee members, or industry professionals whose standing within the financial services sector provided credibility that my status as a concerned citizen could not match. I would recommend submitting your analysis to the SEC's Investment Advisor Regulation Office and the Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration, Director Thompson advised. Both agencies maintain enforcement capabilities that could address the practices you have identified, assuming that your analysis is confirmed through their independent investigation processes. The suggestion represented a path forward, but it also highlighted the institutional biases that protected established firms from accountability while creating barriers for individuals who lacked formal standing within the regulatory system. The federal agencies that possessed enforcement authority would likely approach my complaints with the same skepticism that had characterized my reception at the state level, particularly given my lack of institutional affiliation or professional credentials within the investment advisory industry. The meeting concluded with Director Thompson providing contact information for the appropriate federal regulatory offices, while emphasizing the importance of documenting all concerns through official complaint channels that would create permanent records of the issues I had identified. His professionalism and attention to my analysis had been encouraging, but the regulatory limitations he described created substantial doubts about the effectiveness of working within established institutional frameworks. The drive back to Chicago provided time for reflecting on the lessons learned from my first attempt to address Sterling and Associates' violations through proper regulatory channels. The institutional response had been more professional and substantive than I had anticipated, but the bureaucratic obstacles and jurisdictional limitations created significant barriers to achieving timely resolution of problems that required immediate action to prevent catastrophic losses. The regulatory system appeared designed to respond to problems after they had already caused significant harm rather than preventing foreseeable crises through proactive intervention. The analytical evidence I had presented was mathematically sound and clearly documented systematic violations of fiduciary responsibility, but the institutional mechanisms for addressing such violations were inadequate for situations that required rapid response to time-sensitive threats. More troubling was the recognition that the regulatory framework created incentives for investment advisors to exploit jurisdictional limitations and institutional complexity to avoid accountability for practices that violated both legal requirements and professional standards. The bureaucratic barriers that prevented effective oversight protected firms like Sterling and Associates from consequences that should have resulted from their systematic disregard for client welfare and prudent investment principles. The federal agencies that Director Thompson had recommended represented potential avenues for addressing the violations I had identified, but they also operated within institutional constraints that prioritized procedural compliance over substantive results. The complaint processes that governed federal regulatory action were designed to ensure fairness and due process for regulated entities, but they also created opportunities for sophisticated firms to delay accountability while continuing practices that threatened client welfare. The evening hours following my return from Springfield were spent researching the federal regulatory agencies and complaint procedures that Director Thompson had recommended. The Securities and Exchange Commission's website provided detailed information about investment advisor oversight and enforcement procedures, while the Department of Labor maintained similar resources regarding fiduciary responsibility compliance and pension fund protection. The federal complaint processes appeared more comprehensive and better resourced than the state regulatory system I had encountered earlier in the day. Both agencies maintained specialized divisions with technical expertise in pension fund management and investment advisor regulation, suggesting that my analysis would receive more sophisticated evaluation than had been possible at the state level. However, the federal agencies also operated with larger caseloads and more complex procedural requirements that could delay action for months or years, while the economic conditions that threatened pension fund stability continued to develop. The timeline for regulatory response appeared incompatible with the urgency created by Federal Reserve monetary policy decisions and municipal bond market conditions that would not wait for bureaucratic processes to reach conclusions. The realization that regulatory channels might prove inadequate for preventing the crisis I had identified created the need for considering alternative approaches that could achieve more immediate results. The institutional barriers that protected Sterling and Associates from accountability also created opportunities for more direct action that could expose their practices to public scrutiny and market consequences that would be more immediate and effective than regulatory sanctions. The Harold Washington Library Center stood as a monument to public access and democratic information sharing in the heart of Chicago's financial district, its neoclassical architecture providing dignified contrast to the gleaming corporate towers that housed the investment firms and regulatory agencies that governed American retirement security. The library's Business and Economics Research Division occupied the entire 8th floor, providing sophisticated analytical resources that rivaled those available at major universities and financial institutions. I arrived at the library on Monday morning with a strategic plan that would require extensive use of their specialized databases, regulatory archives, and legal research facilities to construct comprehensive documentation of the systematic violations that characterize Sterling and Associates' pension fund management practices. The weekend had provided time for developing a methodical approach to gathering evidence that would support federal regulatory complaints while also exploring alternative strategies for protecting public employee retirement security. The research objectives I had established required investigation across multiple domains of financial regulation, pension fund law, and regulatory enforcement precedents that would demonstrate both the severity of the violations I had identified and the legal mechanisms available for compelling corrective action. The analytical work would also need to establish clear documentation of the timeline and causation factors that connected Richard's investment decisions to the potential catastrophic outcomes that my financial modeling had projected. The government publications section maintained comprehensive archives of Federal Reserve monetary policy documents, Securities and Exchange Commission enforcement actions, and Department of Labor fiduciary responsibility guidance that provided the regulatory framework for evaluating pension fund investment practices. The historical precedents contained within these official publications would establish the legal standards that governed institutional investment management, while documenting the enforcement mechanisms that federal agencies employed when addressing systematic violations. My first research priority focused on Federal Reserve interest rate guidance and monetary policy projections that would determine the economic environment facing municipal bond portfolios during the next 18 months. The central bank's published research and policy statements provided clear indication that aggressive interest rate increases were not only likely but essential for addressing inflationary pressures that threatened long-term economic stability. The Federal Open Market Committee minutes from the previous 6 months revealed systematic progression toward more restrictive monetary policy that would begin with modest rate increases but accelerate rapidly if inflation indicators continued trending above target levels. The economic modeling published by Federal Reserve research staff projected interest rate scenarios that would devastate the long-duration municipal bond portfolios that comprised the largest components of Sterling and Associates' pension fund investments. The quantitative analysis contained within Federal Reserve research publications provided mathematical confirmation of the interest rate risk projections I had developed during my initial investigation of Sterling and Associates' portfolio vulnerabilities. The central bank's own stress testing results indicated that municipal bond portfolios with duration characteristics similar to those managed by Richard's firm would experience principal losses exceeding 30% under moderate tightening scenarios and potentially 50% if economic conditions required more aggressive monetary policy responses. The Securities and Exchange Commission Enforcement Database provided extensive documentation of previous regulatory actions against investment advisors who had violated fiduciary responsibility requirements through inappropriate risk management, inadequate disclosure practices, and conflicts of interest that prioritized firm profits over client welfare. The legal precedents established through these enforcement actions demonstrated clear regulatory authority for addressing the practices that characterized Sterling and Associates' pension fund management. The enforcement cases that most closely paralleled the violations I had identified involved investment advisors who had concentrated client portfolios in securities that generated favorable fees or political benefits, while exposing clients to inappropriate risk levels. The SEC's enforcement actions in these cases had resulted in substantial civil penalties, business practice restrictions, and individual sanctions against executives who had prioritized personal interests over fiduciary obligations. The legal framework established through these precedent cases provided clear guidance regarding the evidentiary standards and documentation requirements that would support successful regulatory enforcement against Sterling and Associates. The enforcement actions demonstrated that federal regulators possessed both the authority and the analytical capability necessary to address systematic violations when presented with comprehensive evidence that met established legal standards. The Department of Labor's Employee Benefit Security Administration maintained parallel enforcement authority regarding fiduciary responsibility violations that affected pension fund management. The regulatory guidance published by this agency established specific requirements for prudent investment practices, diversification strategies, and risk management procedures that governed institutional management of retirement assets. The fiduciary responsibility framework developed by the Department of Labor emphasized the primacy of participant welfare over all other considerations in pension fund investment decisions. The regulatory guidance explicitly prohibited investment strategies that prioritized management fees, political relationships, or business development opportunities when such considerations conflicted with optimal portfolio management for retirement security. The enforcement precedents established by the Department of Labor included cases involving pension fund managers who had accepted inappropriate compensation arrangements, failed to implement adequate diversification strategies, and maintained conflicts of interest that compromised their ability to serve participant interests effectively. The sanctions imposed in these cases demonstrated serious consequences for fiduciary violations that threatened retirement security. The municipal bond market research that I conducted during the afternoon hours revealed additional evidence supporting the concentration risk analysis I had completed regarding Sterling and Associates' portfolio management. The academic studies and industry reports available through the library's financial databases confirmed the correlation patterns between regional economies and municipal fiscal capacity that created systematic vulnerability in geographically concentrated bond portfolios. The research publications demonstrated that municipal bond defaults historically occurred in clusters that reflected regional economic stress rather than isolated fiscal problems affecting individual municipalities. The correlation analysis contained within these studies provided quantitative confirmation of the systematic risks that characterized portfolios concentrated in economically related municipalities. The industry reports prepared by rating agencies and bond insurers revealed additional concerns about the municipal bond market segments that comprised the largest holdings in Sterling and Associates pension portfolios. The credit analysis contained within these reports indicated deteriorating fiscal conditions among municipalities whose economies depended on industries facing regulatory pressure and technological disruption. The environmental regulations affecting coal-fired power generation, the trade policies impacting automotive manufacturing, and the technological changes transforming traditional industries created systematic pressure on municipal revenues that supported bond payments. The research indicated that these economic trends were irreversible and would continue regardless of political developments or industry lobbying efforts. The legal research that I conducted during the evening hours focused on private civil enforcement mechanisms that could complement regulatory action while providing more immediate protection for pension fund participants. The Employee Retirement Income Security Act provided private right of action for pension fund participants who suffered losses due to fiduciary violations, creating opportunities for class action litigation that could achieve faster results than regulatory enforcement procedures. The precedent cases involving ERISA litigation demonstrated successful private enforcement against investment advisors who had violated fiduciary obligations through inappropriate investment strategies, undisclosed conflicts of interest, and inadequate risk management practices. The damage awards and settlement agreements in these cases provided compensation for participants while establishing legal precedents that deterred similar violations by other investment managers. The class action litigation framework offered several advantages over regulatory enforcement for addressing the systematic violations that characterize Sterling and Associates' pension fund management. Private litigation could proceed independently of regulatory agency priorities and resource constraints, while providing immediate injunctive relief that could compel corrective action before economic conditions triggered catastrophic losses. The discovery procedures available through federal civil litigation would provide access to internal Sterling and Associates communications, financial records, and strategic planning documents that would reveal the full scope of their violations while establishing clear evidence of intentional disregard for fiduciary obligations. The legal precedents indicated that private litigation could achieve comprehensive remedies that protected participant interests while imposing meaningful consequences for fiduciary violations. The investigative journalism research that I conducted during the final hours of my library session revealed additional strategies for exposing Sterling and Associates' practices to public scrutiny that could complement regulatory and legal action. The financial media coverage of previous pension fund scandals demonstrated the effectiveness of public disclosure for compelling corrective action when regulatory enforcement proved inadequate or delayed. The precedent cases involving journalistic investigation of pension fund mismanagement showed how media coverage could trigger regulatory action, political oversight, and industry reforms that protected retirement security more effectively than isolated enforcement actions. The investigative reports had also provided public education about fiduciary responsibility violations that enabled pension fund participants to advocate more effectively for their interests. The media strategy research revealed specific journalists and publications that specialized in pension fund coverage and possessed the analytical expertise necessary to evaluate complex financial evidence. The financial journalists who had exposed previous violations had typically developed sources within regulatory agencies, industry organizations, and academic institutions that could provide independent confirmation of investigative findings. The comprehensive research that I completed during this intensive session at the Harold Washington Library provided several crucial insights that would guide my strategic approach to addressing Sterling and Associates' violations. The regulatory framework clearly supported enforcement action against the practices I had identified, while the legal precedents demonstrated successful private remedies for fiduciary violations affecting pension fund participants. The economic analysis confirmed that the timeline for corrective action was compressed by Federal Reserve monetary policy decisions and municipal bond market conditions that were already in motion and could not be reversed through political intervention or industry lobbying. The mathematical modeling demonstrated that immediate action was essential to prevent catastrophic losses that would affect hundreds of thousands of public employees. The research also revealed that comprehensive action would require coordination between multiple strategies that could reinforce each other while addressing different aspects of the systematic violations that threatened pension fund security. Regulatory enforcement, private litigation, and public disclosure could work together to achieve more effective protection for participants than any single approach could accomplish independently. The evidence that I had gathered provided mathematical confirmation of the violations while establishing clear legal authority for corrective action through multiple enforcement mechanisms. The analytical documentation met the evidentiary standards established through previous enforcement cases, while providing quantitative projections that demonstrated the urgency of immediate intervention. The research had also revealed the importance of strategic timing that could maximize the effectiveness of disclosure, while minimizing opportunities for Sterling and Associates to implement defensive measures that might delay accountability or transfer losses to participants. The economic conditions and regulatory environment created a window of opportunity that would require precise coordination to achieve optimal results. The library's resources had provided access to information and analytical tools that would have been unavailable through independent research, demonstrating the importance of utilizing public institutions that supported democratic access to information necessary for protecting citizen interests. The comprehensive documentation that I had compiled would support multiple strategies for achieving accountability while protecting vulnerable people from financial exploitation. The Sterling and Associates quarterly partners meeting convened at precisely 8 o'clock on Tuesday morning in the firm's executive conference room, where 18 senior investment professionals gathered to review portfolio performance, discuss strategic initiatives, and address operational matters that required collective decision-making. The mahogany table that dominated the room had witnessed countless discussions about client relationships, investment strategies, and business development opportunities. But today's meeting would reveal the systematic organizational failures that prevented recognition of the most serious threats facing their pension fund clients. I occupied my customary position near the back of the room, maintaining the same invisible presence that had characterized my attendance at these quarterly reviews for the past 8 years. Richard had established this practice early in our marriage as part of his strategy for demonstrating family stability and traditional values to business partners who valued conservative approaches to both financial management and personal relationships. My role during these meetings involved silent observation while projecting an image of supportive engagement that enhanced Richard's reputation for balanced leadership and sound judgment. The agenda for this quarterly review followed the standard format that Richard had implemented to ensure efficient use of executive time while maintaining focus on metrics that supported continued business growth. The discussion began with portfolio performance reports from each department head, followed by client relationship updates, regulatory compliance summaries, and strategic planning presentations that addressed expansion opportunities and competitive challenges. Senior Portfolio Manager David Richardson presented the quarterly performance results for their largest pension fund accounts, emphasizing favorable comparisons with benchmark indices while highlighting fee income that had exceeded projections by 12% during the previous quarter. His presentation included detailed charts and graphs that demonstrated consistent returns and steady asset growth across their institutional client base. Our municipal bond strategies continue to deliver superior risk-adjusted returns while maintaining the diversification requirements that our pension fund clients expect, Richardson explained, displaying performance data that appeared to validate the investment approaches that characterize Sterling and Associates portfolio management. The geographic diversification across 12 states and sector allocation among infrastructure, education, and general obligation bonds provides stability that has protected our clients from the volatility affecting other asset classes. The performance metrics that Richardson presented reflected the sophisticated reporting techniques that Richard's firm employed to emphasize favorable outcomes while minimizing attention to risk concentrations that might concern clients or regulatory authorities. The quarterly reports focused on absolute returns and benchmark comparisons, rather than correlation analysis or stress testing results that would reveal portfolio vulnerabilities. Chief Compliance Officer Margaret Torres followed with regulatory updates that addressed recent guidance from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Labor regarding fiduciary responsibility requirements and investment advisor oversight. Her presentation emphasized the firm's commitment to maintaining the highest standards of regulatory compliance while protecting client interests through prudent investment practices. Our compliance monitoring systems continue to demonstrate adherence to all applicable regulations governing pension fund management, Torres reported, consulting notes that summarized their quarterly regulatory review procedures. The diversification metrics, risk management protocols, and disclosure practices that govern our institutional investment operations meet or exceed all federal and state requirements for fiduciary responsibility compliance. The compliance framework that Torres described reflected the bureaucratic approach to regulatory adherence that characterized most institutional investment firms, where procedural compliance with technical requirements often substituted for substantive analysis of portfolio risks or client welfare considerations. The quarterly compliance reviews focused on documentation and reporting procedures rather than independent evaluation of investment decisions or strategic planning assumptions. Director of Business Development Patricia Walsh provided updates regarding new client acquisitions and expansion opportunities that could enhance the firm's market position during the next fiscal year. Her presentation included detailed analysis of competitive positioning, fee structure optimization, and relationship management strategies that supported continued growth in assets under management. The pipeline for new pension fund clients remains robust, with particular strength among municipal employee retirement systems that value our expertise in public sector investment management, Walsh reported. displaying client acquisition projections that indicated potential asset growth exceeding 15% during the next 12 months. The political relationships and regulatory expertise that distinguish our firm from competitors continue to attract clients who prioritize stability and long-term performance over short-term market fluctuations. The business development strategy that Walsh outlined emphasized the political connections and regulatory relationships that provided Sterling and Associates with competitive advantages in acquiring pension fund clients. The approach prioritized relationship management and regulatory positioning over analytical capabilities or investment performance metrics that might better serve client interests. The strategic discussion that followed these departmental presentations revealed the organizational culture and decision-making processes that prevented recognition of the systematic risks that threatened their largest clients. The executive conversation focused primarily on business development opportunities, competitive positioning, and fee optimization, rather than investment analysis or risk management considerations that might identify portfolio vulnerabilities. Richard's leadership during this strategic discussion demonstrated the management approach that had enabled systematic disregard for analytical input while maintaining focus on business metrics that supported continued firm growth. His questions and comments emphasized client relationship management and political considerations, rather than quantitative analysis or regulatory compliance issues that might require uncomfortable adjustments to established practices. The federal regulatory environment appears stable for the foreseeable future, Richard observed, addressing concerns about potential policy changes that might affect their business operations. The relationships we have cultivated with regulatory officials and elected representatives provide advance notice of any developments that could impact our investment strategies or client management approaches. The confidence that Richard displayed regarding regulatory stability reflected his belief that political relationships could provide protection from accountability mechanisms that might otherwise compel adherence to fiduciary responsibility requirements or prudent investment principles. His approach to regulatory compliance emphasized relationship management rather than analytical excellence or substantive compliance with client protection standards. The discussion regarding interest rate risk and monetary policy implications revealed the organizational blindness that prevented recognition of the most serious threats facing their pension fund portfolios. The executive team treated Federal Reserve guidance as abstract policy information, rather than immediate risk factors that required strategic response through portfolio rebalancing or risk management adjustments. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy communications suggest gradual adjustments that should not significantly impact our municipal bond strategies, commented senior investment analyst Robert Chen, whose analysis had apparently failed to recognize the duration risk implications that my research had identified. The quality and diversification of our municipal bond portfolios provide sufficient protection against interest rate volatility that might affect lower-grade securities. The risk assessment that Chen presented contradicted the mathematical modeling that I had completed regarding interest rate sensitivity and portfolio vulnerability to Federal Reserve policy changes. His analysis appeared to rely on historical performance data rather than forward-looking stress testing that would reveal the potential impact of monetary policy tightening on long-duration municipal bond portfolios. The strategic planning discussion that concluded the quarterly meeting demonstrated the organizational priorities that prevented effective risk management or analytical oversight of investment decisions that could affect hundreds of thousands of pension fund participants. The conversation focused on market share expansion, fee income optimization, and competitive positioning rather than portfolio risk assessment or fiduciary responsibility compliance. Our strategic objectives for the next fiscal year emphasize continued growth in assets under management while maintaining the premium fee structures that reflect the value we provide to institutional clients. Richard summarized, outlining goals that prioritized firm profitability over client welfare considerations. The political relationships and regulatory positioning that distinguish our firm from competitors will enable us to capitalize on opportunities while avoiding the compliance burdens that constrain less sophisticated investment advisors. The meeting concluded with general agreement regarding strategic priorities and operational objectives that would guide firm activities during the next quarter. The executive consensus reflected shared commitment to business development goals, while revealing systematic disregard for analytical concerns or risk management considerations that might interfere with profitable client relationships. The organizational culture that this quarterly meeting revealed operated through systematic exclusion of analytical input that might challenge established practices or threaten business relationships that supported firm profitability. The decision-making processes emphasized consensus building among executives whose compensation and career advancement depended on supporting Richard's strategic direction rather than independent evaluation of investment decisions or client welfare considerations. The absence of meaningful risk assessment or strategic planning discussions demonstrated how organizational hierarchies could suppress analytical capabilities, even when those capabilities existed within the firm's professional staff. The senior investment analysts and portfolio managers who attended this meeting possessed the technical knowledge necessary to identify the risks that I had documented, but the institutional culture prevented them from raising concerns that might challenge Richard's authority or threaten established business practices. The systematic exclusion of dissenting viewpoints or alternative analytical perspectives created organizational blindness that prevented recognition of serious problems until external forces compelled acknowledgement of risks that internal analysis should have identified months earlier. The quarterly meeting format itself contributed to this institutional failure by emphasizing consensus and agreement rather than independent thinking or critical evaluation of strategic assumptions. The cultural dynamics that governed these executive interactions reflected broader patterns within the financial services industry, where relationship management and political positioning often received greater emphasis than analytical excellence or fiduciary responsibility compliance. The institutional incentives that guided executive behavior encouraged conformity and consensus, rather than independent analysis or ethical leadership that might conflict with business development priorities. The recognition that Sterling and Associates operated through systematic suppression of analytical input created understanding of why my attempts to raise risk management concerns had been dismissed with such casual confidence. The organizational culture that Richard had created was designed to prevent exactly the kind of independent analytical thinking that could identify problems with established investment strategies or business practices. The institutional blindness that characterized this quarterly meeting extended beyond simple ignorance or analytical oversight to encompass deliberate organizational design that prioritized political relationships and fee generation over client welfare and regulatory compliance. The systematic exclusion of risk assessment from strategic planning discussions created conditions that enabled violations of fiduciary responsibility, while protecting executives from accountability for decisions that threaten client interests. The evening hours following this quarterly meeting provided time for reflecting on the organizational dynamics that prevented effective governance or oversight of investment decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of pension fund participants. The institutional culture that I had observed represented a systematic failure of corporate responsibility that extended far beyond individual incompetence or ethical lapses to encompass organizational design that prioritized private interests over public welfare. The evidence of institutional blindness that this meeting had revealed strengthened the case for external intervention through regulatory enforcement, private litigation, or public disclosure that could compel accountability when internal governance mechanisms had failed completely. The organizational culture that prevented recognition of serious risks would not respond to internal reform efforts or voluntary compliance initiatives that depended on executive cooperation or ethical leadership. The weight of impending decision pressed against my consciousness as I sat in our Lincoln Park Mansion study during the early morning hours of Wednesday, surrounded by the comprehensive documentation that detailed Sterling and Associates' systematic violations of fiduciary responsibility. The financial projections and regulatory analysis spread across my mahogany desk represented more than academic exercises or intellectual pursuits. They constituted evidence of institutional betrayal that threatened the retirement security of hundreds of thousands of public employees, while creating moral obligations that would define my character and determine my legacy. The personal consequences of challenging Richard's authority and exposing his firm's violations extended far beyond professional considerations to encompass fundamental questions about family loyalty, financial security, and social relationships that had shaped my identity for 15 years. The decision to take action against Sterling and Associates would not simply affect my marriage or my social standing within Chicago's financial community. It would transform every aspect of my existence while creating uncertainties about my ability to maintain the lifestyle and relationships that had provided stability and meaning during my years as Richard's supportive wife. The financial implications of confronting Richard represented the most immediate and quantifiable risks associated with exposing his firm's systematic violations. Our household finances were structured around his position as founder and chief executive officer of Sterling and Associates, with investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and lifestyle expenditures that depended entirely on his continued success within the financial services industry. The comfortable existence that we had built together would not survive the professional destruction that would inevitably result from regulatory sanctions, civil litigation, and criminal prosecution that my evidence could trigger. The Lincoln Park mansion, where we had entertained clients and business associates for 8 years, was financed through loans that used Richard's ownership stake in Sterling and Associates as collateral. The mortgage obligations and property taxes that supported our residence required income streams that would disappear if regulatory enforcement or civil litigation destroyed his firm's operations and eliminated his primary source of wealth. The lifestyle that had enabled me to focus on analytical work rather than immediate income generation was entirely dependent on his continued professional success. The investment portfolios that comprised our personal wealth were concentrated in financial services sector securities and alternative investments that Richard had accessed through industry relationships and business connections. The regulatory sanctions and reputational damage that would result from exposing systematic fiduciary violations would devastate these holdings, while eliminating opportunities for recovering losses through traditional investment strategies that required industry credibility and relationship access. The social consequences of challenging Richard's authority represented equally significant personal costs that extended beyond immediate financial considerations to encompass relationships and community connections that had provided identity and meaning during my years as his wife. The social circles that we had cultivated within Chicago's financial and political communities were built around his professional reputation and business relationships that would not survive the revelations that my evidence would trigger. The charity board positions and civic organizations that had occupied my time and attention for 8 years were connected to Sterling and Associates through donor relationships and political connections that prioritized business development over genuine philanthropic commitment. The friendships and professional relationships that I had developed through these activities would likely dissolve when Richard's professional destruction eliminated the business considerations that had motivated many of these social connections. The country club memberships, cultural institution patronage, and social event participation that had comprised my public identity were entirely dependent on our financial capacity and social standing within Chicago's business community. The regulatory enforcement and civil litigation that would result from exposing Richard's violations would eliminate both the resources and the relationships necessary to maintain these social connections and community involvements. The family considerations that complicated my decision extended beyond immediate household implications to encompass relationships with extended family members whose economic circumstances and professional opportunities were connected to Sterling and Associates through employment arrangements, investment relationships, and business partnerships. Richard's sister Patricia worked as a senior vice president within the firm's institutional sales division, while his brother Michael served on the board of directors and maintained substantial personal investments in fund operations that would be devastated by regulatory sanctions. My own siblings had received financial assistance from Richard during various personal crises, including educational expenses for their children, and emergency funding during medical emergencies and business failures that had threatened their financial stability. The grateful dependence that these family members felt toward Richard created additional emotional pressure against taking actions that would destroy his capacity to provide continued support during future emergencies or opportunities. The consideration that Richard's parents, now in their 70s, maintained retirement investments that were heavily concentrated in Sterling and Associates funds and related financial products added another dimension to the personal costs associated with exposing systematic violations. The elderly couple who had welcomed me into their family with genuine warmth and affection would suffer devastating financial losses if regulatory enforcement destroyed the firm that provided their primary source of retirement income. The absence of children in our marriage eliminated some potential complications while creating others that affected my decision-making process. The lack of immediate family obligations that might require continued financial stability also meant that I possessed greater freedom to prioritize moral considerations over economic security. when evaluating options for addressing the violations I had discovered. The personal risks that I would assume by challenging Richard's authority would affect primarily my own circumstances, rather than dependent family members who might suffer from decisions they had no voice in making. However, the childless nature of our marriage also meant that my primary source of meaning and identity during the past 8 years had been derived from my role as Richard's supportive wife, rather than maternal responsibilities that might provide alternative foundations for self-worth and purpose. The social identity that would be destroyed by exposing his violations represented my primary connection to community and significance that had replaced the professional identity I had abandoned when we married. The legal considerations that affected my personal situation added complexity to the decision-making process while creating both additional risks and potential protections that would influence the practical consequences of taking action against Sterling and Associates. The Illinois marital property laws that governed asset division in divorce proceedings provided some protection against complete financial devastation, but they also created incentives for Richard to pursue strategies that might minimize my access to resources during potential separation or divorce proceedings. The prenuptial agreement that we had executed before our marriage contained provisions that limited my claims against Richard's business interests and investment assets, while providing modest protection against complete economic abandonment. The agreement had been negotiated during the early stages of our relationship, when I possessed independent income and professional prospects that made financial protection seem less critical than it would prove to be 15 years later. The potential legal liability that I might face as Richard's spouse and business confidant created additional considerations that required careful evaluation before taking action that could expose both of us to regulatory sanctions or criminal prosecution. The access that I had maintained to Sterling and Associates, internal communications and financial records could potentially create legal exposure if regulatory authorities determined that I had participated in or facilitated the violations that my evidence would reveal. The consulting arrangements and administrative roles that I had performed for Sterling and Associates during various periods of our marriage created documented connections to firm operations that might complicate my ability to position myself as an independent whistleblower rather than a participant in the violations I had discovered. The legal framework governing spousal testimony and communications privileges provided some protection, but these safeguards were not absolute and could be overcome under circumstances involving ongoing violations that threatened public welfare. The personal safety considerations that might result from exposing systematic violations involving political relationships and substantial financial interests represented risks that extended beyond immediate family or professional consequences to encompass potential retaliation from powerful interests whose corrupt arrangements my evidence could reveal. The municipal bond market manipulations and political corruption that appeared to be connected to Sterling and Associates operations involved elected officials and business leaders whose responses to exposure might extend beyond civil litigation or regulatory proceedings. The organized nature of the violations that my research had uncovered suggested coordination between multiple parties whose continued freedom and financial interests depended on maintaining secrecy about arrangements that violated both regulatory requirements and criminal statutes. The potential consequences of threatening these arrangements through public disclosure or regulatory complaints could include retaliation that extended beyond traditional business or legal responses to encompass personal safety threats. The emotional and psychological dimensions of the decision I faced represented perhaps the most significant personal stakes associated with exposing Richard's violations. The marriage that had provided stability and identity for 15 years was built on foundations that could not survive the revelations that my evidence would trigger. The relationship that had guided my major life decisions and shaped my understanding of myself would be destroyed by taking action that professional integrity and moral responsibility demanded. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.